Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast, where we take you inside Scottish politics. I'm Calum Macdonald. Hello. And here's Geoff Aberdein, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister, Alex Salmond. Hello, Geoff.
Good morning.
And Andy Maciver, who was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Good morning, all.
Great to have you guys here. Thank you for finding us. Thank you for listening. If this is your first time, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and you'll get our episodes every week. Next week, a podcast special on the way for you. We'll talk about that more in just a minute. First, though, we turn, of course, to our WhatsApp of the week. This is a new thing we're doing, where we pick out one of your messages and start the pod with it. This one is from Drew, who says, obligatory but genuine praise first. I've been listening to the podcast from the very start, and it is consistently brilliant. Thanks, Drew. We know, but it's nice to be reassured of that. In this week's episode, Andy floated the idea that an SNP and Labour coalition at Holyrood after 2026 was possible and perhaps even inevitable, drawing comparisons with the CDU and SPD in Germany and Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil in Ireland. But isn't that a flawed comparison, suggests Drew. In both Germany and Ireland, those coalitions arguably work because the parties come from distinct political traditions and still hold clear ideological differences. The differences with negotiation don't prevent cooperation, but actually help maintain each party's identity while governing as a coalition. The SNP and Labour, by contrast, says Drew, largely compete for the same centre-left space in Scotland, with the Constitution as the only major dividing line. Wouldn't a coalition blur the lines between them, confuse voters, and ultimately weaken both parties' credibility and appeal, making such an arrangement unlikely, if not impossible, asks Drew, or suggests Drew. Andy Maciver.
Thanks, Drew. By the way, I like how you seamlessly said, of course we're turning to our WhatsApp of the week, something that we've never done before.
I think we did it two weeks ago.
Not only do listeners not know it's coming, Geoff and I didn't know it was coming either, but there you go. Good. It's a good idea, though. I like WhatsApp
Thanks
of the
very
week.
much.
Excellent.
Yeah,
good.
Thank you.
Drew, yes. Look, good points, Drew. I suppose, let me say, I think probably in the end, three things about that. Firstly, I take your point on Germany, where it's probably a more traditional right-left split between the CDU and the SPD. It's a little bit different in Ireland, though. Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are actually both pretty much centre-right parties. Ideologically, there's very little that separates them. The main historical dividing line between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil is that they were on opposite sides of the Irish Civil War, which obviously runs pretty deep. I'm not minimising that, but ideologically today, in the 21st century, they're not actually all that different. Well, I suppose what I would say there is don't confuse my I was going to say prediction. That's definitely too strong. Don't confuse my mooting of this being a possibility as support for it. I mean, I think it would still raise a lot of questions as to why in this country we do not have a centre-right, economically liberal alternative to what has become a social democratic consensus in the Scottish Parliament. And all that goes down to the issues around the Tory party and the centre-right in Scotland. So I'm not saying it's a good outcome. Certainly ideologically, in terms of the economy and public service reform, I'm not convinced it is a good outcome, because ultimately you've got two parties who pretty much believe in the same thing, other than the dividing line of independence. I purely moot that there are certain seat number outcomes from May that may make this not only compelling but inevitable. And the more seats reform get, the more likely this becomes.
Geoff, I think you'd had to dip last week by the time we got onto Andy's grand coalition chat. Theoretically, hypothetically, what would a Labour SNP coalition look like? Would it?
Firstly, let me say that there can be no more alarming phrase from Andy Maciver's mouth than I'm just going to take three things to say my point. I mean, your eyes just roll.
I think I only did two. I actually think I only did two.
And then he didn't, and I was just going to say, and then he didn't actually come up with the three things because he bored himself. Like,
it's Maciver's weekly sermon.
Yeah. Firstly, to the likelihood, to Drew's question, it's all dictated by what reform do or don't do. So if reform make a really strong challenge and the numbers fall in a certain way, it might become somewhat of a necessity. Do either of the parties want to do it? No. Because for the reasons actually Drew outlines, they're fighting over a lot of the same territory in a policy space. But I suppose you could turn the argument on its head. It could make a coalition, informal or otherwise, more palatable, given that they are fighting over the same territory. I just don't think that that's certainly not what Labour would want to do, given that they've been out of government for so long. And I certainly know that the SNP would be pretty opposed to that as well. But it all comes down to the rise of reform and how they perform.
Fair. Andy, have you got a third thing just before we move on, or are we just leaving that there?
I mean, obviously I did have, because I wouldn't have said 3 in the first place if I didn't have 3. But that is not the same question as do you remember what your third thing was, to which
Ship
the answer is no.
Here's a tip. Here's never start, right, your contribution by saying, I've got 3 things to say, because you never, ever remember them. Like, you know them all. Just say a couple of points I'd like to make, or a few points.
You should be able to remember 3. Like, if you start saying, I've got 7 points to make on this issue, then you're definitely struggling. But 3, I would have backed myself to remember 3, especially early in the morning. But no.
If it comes back to you at any point, you just shout and let us know.
Will.
Right, on the podcast.
It wasn't that great, to be honest with you, anyway.
On the podcast today, then, John Swinney says something about independence, but has he said enough to convince independent supporters that the SNP are still representing them? We'll actually take some of your comments on that as well. We've been tweeting about that this morning. Plus, a Scottish Government commissioned report suggests a minimum income guarantee would provide a dignified quality of life, deliver financial security, and unlock opportunities for everyone in Scotland. As we'll talk about that as well. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. If you're on YouTube, you can search for Holyrood Sources wherever you want and listen and watch. You can follow us on X. You can watch our clips on TikTok and subscribe to our mailing list at holyroodsources.com. If you'd like to be in the running for our brand new feature, WhatsApp of the Week, and then you could message us 0333 404 6507. Right, before we get to Swinney, before we get to minimum income guarantee, let's just mention that next week on the podcast, we've got a special for you. Holyrood Sources Live is bringing John Swinney and Anas Sarwar together in the battle for Bute House, along with 120 of you to discuss and debate and to question and to consider. We're actually, I suppose we should start here. We have had both of them on the pod since the start of this year. This battle for Bute House is the first of our big look ahead specials ahead of 2026. And I suppose quite a bit's actually changed since we last spoke to them, Geoff. Possibly the Hamilton by-election is the most notable change. Do we expect Anas Sarwar to join us next week and be feeling quite upbeat, quite optimistic? And does he have the right to feel optimistic?
Yes and yes.
How does he play on that then? What does he have to do next week with our live audience? Does he have to start selling a Scottish Labour vision? Is that where we're at in the campaign?
Yes. I mean, does he have a right to be upbeat, and does he have a right to amplify that next week? Yes, he does, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Let's not be under any illusions here. And even, John Curtis, the master psephologist, said that there's still an uphill struggle for Labour. But if he's being honest with himself, Anas Sarwar 3 weeks ago would have thought that he's got no chance of being First Minister. Now he thinks he's got a chance of being First Minister. And so, yes, what we're going to see in the prevailing kind of narratives going forward and the commentariat will be now challenging Anas Sarwar again as if he is going to be First Minister. And what would he do? And how will he stand up to some of the things coming from Westminster that we've talked about ad nauseum on this podcast? So that's going to be an interesting dynamic. And so we have to treat him like Andy and I, you would not be treating him. There's a likelihood of him being First Minister. There is now. There is a chance. So we have to treat him like that, and with all due analysis and forensic interventions, and that's what we'll try and do.
Yeah. Lots of our special next week will be made up of questions and contributions from the audience who are there, Andy. But in terms of issues that we kind of need to get at with these two, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it'll be interesting to see how the persona of each one is different from when we interviewed them along with their deputies earlier in the year, because they both played the game in terms of pretending it was close earlier in the year. In actual fact, neither of them thought the outcome was looking close at all, because by that point it was looking very clear that the SNP were going to win comfortably and Anas Sarwar was going to have a problem. I think it's interesting to see how the psychology of that has changed. For me, that is one of the most interesting things here, is the psychology versus the psephology, if you like, in that if you look at the numbers in that Hamilton by-election, I know that Labour won, but the underlying numbers are not very good for Labour in that by-election. They lost 2%. Not good for the SNP either, obviously. They lost 17%. But John Curtis, as Geoff mentioned, did a seat projection based on uniform swing just in Hamilton. So in other words, he took the 2021 votes in Hamilton and compared them to the by-election votes in Hamilton, and that came out with Labour losing seats, not gaining seats at Holyrood, and the SNP still winning handsomely. In terms of the actual numbers, irrespective of the fact that they won the seat, in terms of the numbers, they were not very good for Labour in Hamilton. But I think the question is, how much does that actually matter when you've got a bit of momentum and when psychologically it feels different? So Swinney's now under a bit of internal pressure, and Sarwar's not. Things feel psychologically different, even if they're not different in terms of the actual data on the ground. So let's see where that takes us and whether it pushes each leader into saying and doing more, not just at our podcast, but over the next year than they otherwise might have.
Yeah. Just to reassure you that, of course, we'll have podcast specials featuring the other parties represented at Holyrood and who wish to be represented at Holyrood as well. All will be invited to take part in podcast episodes and different formats and all of that between now and May 2026. We are starting with Labour and the SNP. We'll move onwards from there. So John Swinney and Anas Sarwar next week. Just to say as well, just by way of admin, that we're recording that on Wednesday evening in Edinburgh. So it'll be Thursday before you hear that. Obviously, if you've got a ticket, you'll be there and hear it live in person first, and let that be a lesson to you that you should always come and join us at our Holyrood Sources live events when they crop up over the next few months as well. Right, let's get into independence then, because speaking at the Scotland 2050 conference yesterday, John Swinney asserted that Westminster treats Scotland as a secondary concern. He's been arguing that Scotland possesses the inherent ability to be self-sufficient and successful. Perhaps not new points from the First Minister, but there does appear to be a new push to emphasise them. Geoff, is that fair to say that this is a kind of renewed energy and renewed focus on independence from John Swinney?
Yeah, I must say that I had no idea this thing was going on at all until Fiona Stalker from the BBC asked me if I'd come on radio and talk about it, and I had no idea what was going on. So I have to say I had to kind of look back at some of the coverage to see all this, and that's perhaps one of the problems, isn't it? Is that they're not garnering as much attention as they would like for this, because it does sound very similar to what has been said in previous years. Look, I wanted to make a couple of points on this, because I think we have to play fair to a certain extent with John Swinney in terms of the constitutional argument that he has inherited, so to speak. In the last 3 years, going back to June 2022, this is when Nicola Sturgeon named the date for the referendum that would be 19th of October 2023. At the same time, though, she referred the issue to the Supreme Court to find out whether Holyrood could have the power to legislate for a referendum. The Supreme Court duly comes back, pretty unsurprising, as we all predicted actually on this podcast, and said, no, Holyrood can't. So there's a bit of a setback and perhaps a tactical misstep from Nicola Sturgeon. But then Nicola Sturgeon responds to that and says, right, okay, we're going to have the next general election in 2025 as a de facto referendum. But then Nicola Sturgeon resigns in February, just a few months later. So one of the most colossal figures of the SNP and of the independence movement says we're going to make this next general election a de facto referendum, and then duly resigns. So already there is more confusion, consternation, and a little bit of lackluster effort that is the perception. And then we have this kind of transition period between Nicola Sturgeon and Humza Yousaf where, well, what does that actually mean? Is this still going to be a de facto referendum, the general election? And if so, is it a majority of MPs? Is it a plurality of MPs? Is it a plurality of votes? And will it mean another referendum? All these, as you remember at the time, not clear answers were given to any of these things. In fact, sometimes they were completely contradictory. That's the context that John Swinney has inherited. And it's, frankly, a bit of a bloody mess. So there hasn't been a coherent strategy throughout that entire period. So what John clearly is doing is he's trying to re-establish what he believes is the emotional and logical case for independence. And I have a lot of sympathy with that because, there has been pro-independence majorities and they have been ignored. And, we've had calls for a codification of how you have a referendum, and I believe Stephen Noon and Casey Dugdale on this podcast revealed what that might look like, giving powers to the Scottish Secretary should they believe there is enough support for it. Because Stephen Noon is now in government, incidentally, that might be an indication of where John Swinney's going. We'll have to see if that manifests itself. But what yesterday taught me was nothing new in the sense of the arguments, but what it did tell me is that John will pretty soon, in my opinion, come up with a strategy, because you can't fly the independence flag and then just go quiet. Because then you're at risk of really frustrating an already frustrated movement. So I would expect in the coming weeks that a strategy will present itself. Now, what that looks like, we'll have to wait and see. But maybe there's a clue with Stephen Noone being in government. Maybe, as I've said before in this podcast, they'll seek to make the next election about the right to choose, which we always know polls very well amongst people. Okay, they might not agree with independence, but I think people should have the right to decide that. So we'll wait and see what happens, but it's definitely coming now. I think we can say that for certain.
I'm listening intently to Jeffrey there. I think
my Sunday name. I must have been bad. What have I done?
No, nothing at all. You've been outstanding and wonderful as usual. I have tremendous sympathy for the. I'm quite a constitutional fundamentalist when it comes to this, to be honest.
Yeah.
If you run in an election based on a manifesto where you basically have your top line as being, if we win, there should be a referendum on independence, and you then win on that basis, I think there should be one, and I think there should have been one after 2021. I think the mandate in 2016, which was kind of loosely predicated on maybe a Brexit, maybe not a Brexit, was too woolly. But for me, 2021 was quite clear, and there should be a referendum. And it's difficult. I think it's a problem for the UK state that there is not a process in place which allows for this to happen. I think that calls into question the union by consent. So I get that there is frustration there, and I share it, actually, even though I voted no last time. And I also see the dilemma that John Swinney is in. And I think this is something that we'll speak to him about next week, which is that he's got, on the one side of the balance sheet, he's in charge of a government which has not been good for most of the last 2 decades. It's, lacked delivery in key areas. And there's also the issue of economic uncertainty created by constitutional flux. And he's made the economy his number one priority. So on one side, he's got that. On the other side, though, he's got the fact that Nigel Farage is sitting there as potentially the biggest boost to the independence campaign that you could possibly have, and to a degree is an open goal. And along with internal pressure that he's under post-Hamilton by-election, it's very difficult for him not to talk about independence. I suppose what I would say, to summarise it though, right, is that, ultimately, how do you get to the point where independence becomes deliverable and becomes inevitable and, gets to the point where London really has no choice but to grant a referendum? And the only answer to that is when such a large number of people are in favour of it, that it can't be ignored, it's too compelling. And how do you get to that point? Well, that's the same argument as there's always been. I mean, if I look in the mirror and say to myself, as a sort of non-party, non-partisan, fairly persuadable person who's not particularly British nationalist or Scottish nationalist, would just rather things weren't so crap, I say to myself, look, how do I vote yes? Well, the only answer to that question is I vote yes if Scotland looks better than the UK does. If Scotland looks like it's got a better health service, better education system, better economic prospects, and so on. And the absolute reality is, at the moment, it doesn't. Yeah. And so why would I bother? And I think until you get to the point where that is such a compelling case that it's very obvious what the answer to that question should be, a lot of the rest of the stuff, I think, is moot, to be honest.
But on that, Andy, and perhaps this is best elaborated by Glenn Campbell at BBC Scotland, who sets out the dilemma. He says, if Swinney is perceived to be talking about independence too much, he risks undermining his own commitment to focus on fixing problems in devolved public services. If he is seen to be talking about independence too little, he risks alienating those within and beyond the membership of the SNP who support this political project. So he's got a balance to strike between talking about independence to keep independent supporters happy without detracting from exactly what you're saying, the ability perhaps to convince others by way of fixing public services.
But, sorry, but it's not as hard as you're making it sound, you two. John Swinney has made the economy his big priority. Who holds the purse strings for the vast majority of Scotland's economy? And so, that's Westminster, incidentally, for listeners and viewers. But let me finish this point, right? Because a lot of people try and rewrite history as to how we got the first referendum. And, this is one area I'm pretty confident on because I was there and I was part of it. And what happened was we went into 2011 on a platform of record, team and vision. The record, we could stand on our record and say we've been pretty decent, actually, overall, in terms of our delivery. We had a pretty good team that was well known and well respected, if not necessarily always liked. But that doesn't happen in politics. But respected is really important. And our vision was, essentially, look at what we have managed to achieve within the limits of devolution, and let's consider what we could achieve with the powers of full independence. Now, that mantra was unbelievably successful. It chimed with the electorate. And I would just urge John Swinney and those around him to find a similar mantra that follows that formula. Now, to do that, as Andy says, you have to demonstrate competence in government. Now, people might get annoyed at this and say, well, we can't do this because of Westminster, but I'm afraid to get people confident enough to back you to say, okay, we will have another look at this issue in terms of full powers, then you have to be viewed as a competent government delivering for the people of Scotland. Now, frankly, in recent years, has not been the case. And I would contend there's been a number of issues that have been pursued by Holyrood that have been pretty on the frippery, if we put it that way, politely. And I think there needs to be a core focus on that. But on the economy itself, you can make that point. Look what we want to do as a Scottish government, how we want to assist industry, how we want to accelerate the green industrialisation of our country, take advantage of these massive opportunities, incentivise investment. But we can't do it all because, frankly, we don't have the powers. Now, that's a simple argument to explain to the people of Scotland, and I think it can be done, but it's not being done so far, and that's why independence, the thought of independence right now is in 50 to up to 55%, eeksy peeksy, but support for the SNP is down in the 30s, low to mid 30s, and that's why there is that gap right now.
So let me come in on that then, and I don't think what I'm about to say, I don't think this disagrees with what you're saying. I think what I'm about to say backs up what you're saying. But there are things that you can do and things that you can't. I think that's right, especially in the economic area. There's a lot of things that you can't. If you look at the things that you can do, the NHS is a whole different podcast. But we have a situation now where there's very reasonable anecdotal evidence from universities all around the country that they are taking Scottish school leavers and effectively having to put them into remedial courses in first year of university because they're so far behind kids from other countries. Now, if that is not a flashing red light about the state of our education system, I don't know what is. And that is nothing to do with anybody else other than the people in the Scottish Parliament. So there are things that don't require different funding mechanisms or anything else that it might be from Westminster. But let me ask you this, Geoff, on the issue of a lot of the economic powers, because I agree with you. I don't think we do have enough economic and tax powers here to make a real difference. But why do we not get specific requests from the Scottish Government to the UK Government for that sort of thing? So, for example, we have a third world trunk road infrastructure all around this country. And part of that, we can't do anything about it because we don't have the borrowing powers. So why is the Scottish Government not saying, by the way, we want to dual this, and this. That's in our programme, but we need the devolution of borrowing powers to do it. Why are they not saying we want to attract major multinational companies to the Central Belt to base themselves here, so please devolve corporation tax so that we can cut it and make ourselves more competitive? I don't hear them asking for any of those things.
I am going to, and I hate this position I'm in, to violently agree with you. If you want to demonstrate tangibly to the electorate out there how independence can make a difference, you agitate for the powers and you link it to tangible examples like Andy has just done there and say, can he do this, guys? And that's just a fact of life. There's certain things we can do, and we can do a lot better incidentally, but if we want to do this transformational projects or really get all systems going in our economy, we need these powers. And agitate and campaign for individual powers. Use the period that there has been. And I thought it was a really kind of I have to say this, but I think Nicola Sturgeon kind of missed the boat in that respect. When you're in this constitutional argument, you're not making a breakthrough and you're not bringing the people necessarily with you, then you agitate around specifics, tangibles in this order. And I think that that's what should have been done. It still should be done, because that's how you explain what the difference of independence could mean personally to your everyday lives. Right now, it's very ethereal, if that's the right word. If I'm trying to say, it's very kind of conceptual in people's minds just now. It's a better way of putting it. Make it real for folk and use the intervening period. Not talking about going to the Supreme Court and de facto this and de facto that. You demonstrate to the people how it can make their lives better. Now, that's a debate worth having. And then you can come in there with your opposition and say, sorry, do you not want to have power over these things, guys? And that's how you're having a debate on your premise, not on process, not on procedure. Anyway, bugger it, it's not been done. Very disappointing. But Andy, I agree with you, sadly.
Terrifying for us all. I suppose just before we move on from this, the word that I've written down that seems to be underpinning what you're both saying is optimism. And perhaps and that feeds into the vision thing, I think, Geoff, that you were talking about. But perhaps the argument's got too negative. Because actually, if you're presenting a kind of optimistic, sunny uplands vision for the future, that's difficult to argue against if you're in opposition to a referendum or if you're an opposition party. And at the moment, it's all very negative. It feels like everyone's being dragged down by it. And the arguments around independence.
I'm not necessarily sure I agree with that. Look, I just don't think there's any been sophisticated or real oomph or campaign for this. I mean, we've had, under Humza Yousaf and Nicola Sturgeon, we had a lot of independence papers that came and went, was commentated on by the usual people, folk like us. It didn't break through or cut through to the public psyche. And I just think the big mistake there has not been, I'm going to repeat myself, is not taking specific examples of where you believe independence can be better and have a debate in those terms. And unionists will oppose you. Fine, you're debating on your terms. They're responding to you, which is exactly where you want to be in politics. There's been so little of that strategic thought in recent years. It's pretty frustrating, I think, for anyone of a pro-independence viewpoint. Now, look, and we've got other things to talk about. I always remember Alex Salmond said, when you're negotiating, do so from a position of strength. And if you ain't strong, by goodness, don't reveal your hand and make it look like you're not strong. And the problem that I have, I think, with the strategy, if it can be called that, over the last sort of 5 years, is the SNP have not been in a position of strength, but worse than that, they've revealed that they're not strong in this argument. And I think that with, particularly the decision to go to the Supreme Court and then just throwing out de facto referendums, clearly without briefing your entire ranks about what that actually means, we look weak. And if folk, don't be surprised when folk go, these guys don't have a clue what they're talking about.
Just a few of your tweets on this. Obviously not scientific. These are just those of you who have replied by the time of recording. We asked whether you sort of agree really with, or what you think of John Swinney's comments on independence that were made yesterday at this conference. Colin says, where he couldn't muster even 30% of the vote. Scotland has clearly moved on. Swinney should too. Colin replied to that about 7:30 this morning, so he's feeling energised. John says, whether it's Nicola Sturgeon, Humza Yousaf or John Swinney, no SNP politician should have the ability to decimate our public services and drive our country into the ground whilst weaponising independence and remaining unaccountable. Fraser says, finally on this, for me, the central issue with independence since 2014 has been procedural. How does a Scottish government hold a referendum despite UK government refusal? The SNP need to reframe this as Scotland's right to choose and propose change to the Scotland Act, suggests Fraser, to gain referendum powers. Is that Geoff's burner account? I think on Twitter. Thank you for these. We post every Wednesday morning before we start recording to just get your thoughts on one of the things we'll be talking about. So keep a lookout for that on X and you can take part as well. Right, let's just give a few minutes to a new report that concludes, based on 2024-2025 prices, that level would be £11,500 for a single adult. There'd be more for couples and parents if they have no other sources of income. Andy, to you first on this. I suppose let's start with, is this a good idea? And I'm going to sidebar it with, is £11,500 really enough to live on? But anyway, is it a good idea?
I've always been quite superficially attracted to minimum income guarantees, or basic income guarantees as they're sometimes called, in a conceptual sense. I think they've always been quite attractive. The difficulty with them is they're very expensive, and everywhere they've been tried so far around the world, they have been shown to basically be too expensive. And I think that the sweet spot would be to find a way to do something like this in concept that doesn't cost so much money, because I think what we have to remember here is that the biggest long-term problem this country has is its expenditure on welfare. And it is an outlier in that respect, especially working age benefits. This is unique in the UK, in Europe, in terms of the amount of money we spend on benefits for working age people. So we spend twice the amount of money on benefits for working age people as we do on defence. All this chat we've got about NATO requirements and 2.5% and all that sort of stuff. We spend twice the amount on working age benefits as we do in defence. Totally unsustainable situation. So any new system has to be one that puts the welfare bill down, doesn't put the welfare bill up. And that's part of the point of basic income guarantees is that it encourages work. And that's the bit of it that I find attractive, because the only way for us to get out of this doom loop of welfare that this country is in is through work. It's not through more welfare. The way to poverty is unbelievably expensive. Keeping people in poverty is very, very expensive. So it's right that it should get probably the primary focus of all policy areas should be poverty alleviation. Not just because it's the right thing to do socially and from a national collective conscience perspective, but because it's very expensive. But the way out of poverty is not more welfare. The way out of poverty is work. And so a basic income guarantee can play a role in that if it is there to encourage work rather than to encourage more welfare dependency.
Between money raised by council tax in Scotland and the equivalent higher levels of revenue in England, with a kind of political take, how realistic do you think this is?
So I think a lot of what Andy said there is spot on, actually, and I'm violently agreeing with him again.
Not again.
Really interesting report, and it is actually a very substantial contribution. The problem is this stuff is so highly political. And I want to refer to, in answering your question, your specific question, to what we said at the start of the programme. The only way I could see this actually taking place in short order in Scotland is if actually you had a Labour and SNP kind of informal or formal arrangement, because they would have to come to an agreement to substantially revise the system. And I agree with Andy, it has to be an all-encompassing system that deals with this, because we are, the Scottish budget is dramatically overweight on social security just now. And so wouldn't it be nice if you could have some sort of arrangement where all of these levers were dealt with within one kind of root and branch reform that might ultimately lead to better outcomes. Final point, I know I say this a lot, but we also just need to have the other balance, part of the balance sheet there as well. I recognise that having people in poverty is no benefit to our economy, but we also need to give opportunities for people to have successful, long, prosperous careers in this country. So there has to be, the two have to go hand in hand.
Yeah, fair. What I'll say is it's nice that there's ideas floating around.
Yeah, and it's a good report.
Quite energising. Thank you, Geoff. Thank you, Andy. And thank you for listening to the Holyrood Sources podcast today. Subscribe to the podcast on your podcast app and on YouTube if you would like to watch the circus. You can do so. Next week, our special podcast is The Battle for Bute House. A live audience will be putting questions to John Swinney and Anas Sarwar. That'll drop into your feeds as well. If you're coming along, we're really looking forward to seeing you there. And by the way, with thanks to Diageo and the Scotch Whisky Association's Made to be Measured campaign, the drinks and the canapes beforehand are free. We'll see you there, and we'll chat to you next week.